Okay, welcome all. In continuing with our series on hair, beards, haircuts, v'chulu, I wanted to talk about the what's today only a Hasidic custom, where a married woman, the minig is that the morning, I think in most kehilas that adhere to this minig, the minig is that the morning after the chasana, the mother or the mother-in-law come together with gifts and etc. And they have like a maimed where they shave off the hair of the married woman, and in those kehilas, married women don't have any hair at all. Of course, they keep it covered, but their hair is completely shaved off. Ad kadei kach, and in certain kehilas, I think Satmar and Skver, possibly others, the halach of the kehila is that a woman whose head is not shaven, a married woman whose head is not shaven, is not allowed to be buried in the cemetery of the kehila. So, by all accounts, it's a minig that's taken extremely seriously in those kehilas. I wanted to just dive into it a little bit and see exactly where it started, exactly where it ended somewhat, and chayena v'chayena. So I want to start like this. In Russia, in the 1800s, the Tsars of Russia controlled very large swaths of land that contained within them, very, very large Jewish kehilas. I think I've seen some numbers ranging maybe up to 5 million Jews lived under the Tsar's rule, the Tsarist rule during the 1800s. Now, no Tsars were lovers of Jews, but there were some Tsars who made their bones being haters of Jews. Now, some of the famed Xeris that Tsarist Russia had against Jews is the famous Cantonist decrees. There was edicts against Jewish chadarim. There were edicts forcing the population to learn Russian. Now, one of the Tsarist Russia's attempts at controlling the Jewish population had to do with clothing. That was called the Xeris HaBegadim, the rules governing clothing. And that's as follows. In the early 1800s, under the rule of Tsar Alexander I, he, who was not a famed anti-Semite, a Russian Tsar could never be said to be not an anti-Semite, but he was not a famed anti-Semite. He made some sort of basic rules geared to convincing and cajoling the Jewish population to dress in Russian clothing. Now, the way he went about that was he imposed fines. He levied fines against people who would not wear Russian clothing. He tried to lean on Rabbanim and Rashi Kahal to force their kehilas to dress in Russian clothing, and etc. Now, he had, interestingly, and this is a theme in a lot of the Xeris that the Russian Tsars imposed against their populace, is they had collaborators, the Maskilim, who considered it as part of their mission to normalize Jews and to make them less peasanty and less provincial and more successful, how they would look at it in the world at large. Maskilim saw it as their role to try to force Jews to be a little more Russian or a little more Polish or German or French, being in whatever area they occupied. So the Maskilim, incidentally, and this documentary evidence is preserved, sent various letters to the Russian government officials, some local governors of different provinces, some even to the Tsar's government himself, encouraging the Tsar and his government to impose, dress codes and dress rules upon the Jewish kehila. Now, Tsar Alexander, his, somewhat tame Xeris in regards to clothing did not have a tremendous impact, and he also wasn't super motivated to fight about it and to keep it going, and therefore it kind of came and went. But Tsar Nikolai, the famous Tsar Nikolai, the one who imposed the Cantonist, the Shrekliche Cantonist Gezeira on Klal Yisrael, and other wonderful gifts, he took up the baton of Xeris on clothing and ran with it. Now, when he was Russian Tsar, he controlled most of Congress Poland, what today we would call Lita and Belarus, which included, cities like Brisk and Vilna and Varsha and the like. He controlled all these cities, and first the rules would start in Russia. Under direct Tsarist rule, there would be rules against the clothing, and then eventually he would import those rules to the areas that were under his dominion, a little further out into the empire, and he would impose these rules on Klal Yisrael. Now, what was different about the Tsarist Xeris HaMabushim, in comparison to other clothing-related edicts in Klal Yisrael's history, was that generally clothing-related edicts in Klal Yisrael's history earlier on was to force Jews to self-identify. The rules in Italy and Germany and even France to a degree, those were rules to force Jews to self-identify as Jews, meaning a Jew had to wear some sort of special, particular article of clothing that would implicate him as a Jew, so that everybody would know he was a Jew and he couldn't blend into polite Christian society. The Russian Gzeirus HaMalbushim was for exactly the opposite reason. The Russian Gzeirus HaMalbushim was the opposite. Instead of trying to isolate Jews and force them to be known as Jews so that they couldn't integrate with the Christian, the Tsar's mevokesh over here was to integrate Jews into the overall population, and therefore his idea was that Jews could no longer wear any clothing that made them discernible as Jews. They had to wear clothing that matched their surroundings, meaning a Russian outfit or a Polish outfit or whatever area or governorship he was engaging with would impose specific rules. Now, seemingly, in Russia itself, where there was many Jews, millions of Jews, it does not seem that they took, I shouldn't say that. It seems that the mahalach to deal with this was more to try to work with this rule and figure out a way how to get along with it, and they didn't consider the clothing that they wore to have such particular significance that it was worth mamash yahar v'yaver for. For example, during this tkufa, when the Tsar was passing these edicts, he created like a v'idah, like a board of Jews who he was going to consult with, in his attempt to normalize the Jews. Now that board was comprised of the Tzemach Tzedek, the second Lubavitcher, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, and Rebitzel of Volozhiner, Rav Chaim Volozhiner's son, together with another frum person who was a businessman whose name I forget now, and one maskil. And upon arriving in St. Petersburg to engage in these meetings that took weeks, these Rabbanim, the Tzemach Tzedek and Rebitzel of Volozhiner, quickly realized that what they were there to do was to rubber stamp the Gzeira to agree to the Tsar's premise that the Jews needed modernization and to rubber stamp the Gzeira. And then each one took their own tact in dealing with this and how they would try to resolve this Gzeira. For example, the Tzemach Tzedek held you had to fight all the way. The Tzemach Tzedek said there's no giving in. This is very important to us. This is central to our religion, and there can't be any psharis made at all. Rebitzel of Volozhin, on the other hand, he seemed to have suggested to the Tsar that to impose modernization on the Jews in this manner just makes you seem heavy-handed. It makes you seem totalitarian. Instead of that, he told them, don't worry. Modernization is the train has already left the station. Jews are becoming modernized just like the rest of Russian society, and left to their own devices, they'll obviously change their clothing to mirror whatever the clothing of the day is. Now, these were two different tacts that were taken to try to convince the Tsar to moderate his stance against the Jews, ultimately to no avail, because Tsar Nikolai continued on with his Gzeirus HaMalbushim and whatever it encompassed. And to me, this story more serves to highlight the different attitudes amongst Rabbanim and Poskim in regards to dealing with these Gzeirus. Meaning, there are those who said, okay, this is not there's no halachas attached to which clothing you wear. Well, as long as your clothing is tzenua and appropriate, there are no halachas attached to it, and therefore, if the Tsar, wants to impose on us that we should wear Russian clothing, so wear Russian clothing, nothing's going to happen to you. And that's why in many kehillas, the Litvaks and a lot of Russian Jews, they made some sort of transition to a more modern mode of dress of the time. And that's why even the old Rabbanim, if you'll see pictures of Rafal Shapiro, the Netziv, etc., old Rabbanim in the Russian Empire used to wear a spadik, even Litvish Rabbanim. But over time, due in large part to the Gzeirus of Tsar Nikolai, that modality of dressing, went away. And that shows us, what Rebitzel of Volozhin, or what the Litvish stance to these Gzeirus seem to have been by and large. On the other hand, Hasidim, and this is not to generalize, not all Hasidim, sought to maintain their style of dressing to a higher degree. Now, where you see these machlekes expressed even more so is when the Gzeirus reached Poland. Now, Warsaw was a big metropolis, a big city with many tens of thousands of Hasidim in it. And that was like a prime targeted area by the local, Russian proper government of Warsaw to force the Jews to comply with the Gzeirus HaMalbushim. Now, over there is where amongst the Rebbes, they're involved in machlekes. Now, there are tshuvas about this from Mashal Shlomo Kluger and Shalom Meshiv. Others write about this. This is mentioned in the tshuvas. Each one with their own stance to exactly the chaimer. But Yiach Shia, the side seemed to have been drawn as follows. The Kotzker, who was, ostensibly the Rebbe of these other Rebbes who I'm going to talk about, the Kotzker, he held that this was not Yahar V'Yaver, this was not such a big deal, and there should be an effort made to shtoltzu to the Russian Gzeira in regards to clothing. Other Rebbes, for example, the Chiddushei HaRim, famously the Chiddushei HaRim and other smaller Rebbes, they held that this was considered a Shas Hashmad, and Shas Hashmad, the halacha is, afil arkis of the Masani, even something an inconsequential, detail of Jewish dress, if it's Shas Hashmad, it's considered a Chilul Hashem and it's Yehar Val Yaver, and therefore he felt the Jews had to fight against these Gzeros and not dress how the Russian government wanted them to dress. Now, a story is told, and I can't vouch for its veracity, but a story is told that some Chassidim came to the Kotzke, and the Kotzke asked him, "Nu, was sagen sie?" Meaning, what do the Rebbes, these other Rebbes, have to say about the Gzera? And they said, "Ze sagen as Yehar Val Yaver." You have to give up your life for this. So the Kotzke supposedly said, "Ich bin euch a shtickl baki in the kleine Oisius." I also know a little bit of learning. I also know the small letters. I'm also knowledgeable in the small letters. And I didn't find that it says over there, Yehar Val Yaver. He says, "Besser volt gewen, it would be better if these Rebbes volt gegeben a bissel adrai, a little push, and bring Shem Mashiach." So the Kotzke had like his criticism of the Chiddush Arim and these other Rebbes were taking a more, hardline position against the Gzeres HaMavushin that the Russian government was advancing. But Yiach Shiyah, this Gzera, so just to finish the story, this Gzera arrives in Warsaw, and the Chiddush Arim, being that he took such a strong stance, became targeted by the government as that he was pushing against the government's rules. He was ultimately arrested and brought down to a prison in Warsaw, and the Chiddush Arim was very well respected and well regarded. I don't know if he was even officially a Rebbe yet at that point, but he was a very, very well regarded leader in Warsaw. He had some sort of like a assistant Rav of Warsaw or something to that effect, and thousands of Jews protested outside the prison to protest the imprisonment of the Chiddush Arim, to the point where the local governor, who I believe was at that point was a brother of the Czar, the regional governor who was a brother of the Czar, felt it would be dangerous to imprison someone of the stature of the Chiddush Arim, and he had the Chiddush Arim freed. Now, the Chiddush Arim and Ritzikal Vorka, other Greiser Rebbes who were highly involved in the Askanas to try to bring this to its conclusion, they decided to seek the help of Sir Moses Montefiore from England, who ultimately comes down and meets with the Tsar's government and tries to get a reprisal for the Jews, but based on Al Kapanim, the documented details based on what his secretary wrote, it seems that Moses Montefiore did not have a good understanding of the Jews of Poland and Russia. He didn't even know what was important to them, and when the Tsar explained to him that this was for the good of the Jews, he didn't really have what to offer back. And until after his trip, when he finally he went to stay in Vilna for a few days, and he stayed in Varsha for a few days, and he finally met some traditionalist Jews, only then did he finally begin to understand what was important to them. But at that point, he wasn't able to get much for them in regards of reprieve, and the law continued winding its way down, to the point where today you could see in Polish Hasidim, ultimately in Russia, I think in like the 1850s, Tsar Nikolai dies, and Tsar Alexander II, who takes over after him, is not as motivated to pursue these laws, and he kind of lets them go. But in Poland, where these laws were not let go, you will see the Chassidim in Poland of Polish origin dressed differently, meaning their payas are tucked into their yarmulkes, their pants are tucked into their socks. These are different holdover. Their hat looks a little different. These are different holdover, customs based on the Tsarist pressure against Jewish clothing. Now, why I mention all this is because one of the most tragic and difficult parts of the Tsar's rule against clothing was his attack on women's dress code. The Tsar also was very against the minig of a woman shaving her head, married woman shaving her head. Now, the Tsar could only have become aware of that through the intervention of the Maskilim, who, as I mentioned earlier, were his helpers in trying to engage in this campaign. And the Tsar became aware that there was a miniging amongst Jewish women to shave their heads, which he felt was extremely backward and unacceptable. He even felt it was a health issue. Al Kapanim tried to be tailored in that. And the Tsar instructed that the minig of women shaving their heads needs to be brought to an end, needs to be brought to a stop. Now, the reason why I say that's so tragic is because the way that they would seek to enforce that is the Tsar sent a large amount of police to different cities. And in particular, there's some documentary stories from Brisk, from Warsaw, where they write of women walking in the street, and police officers would walk over to them and give a yank at whatever they were wearing in their head to be able to see what was underneath. Was it shaven? Was it not shaven? And if they would catch a woman with her hair shaven off in that manner, they would take her to prison for a few days. They would pour cold, icy water on top of her head. So it was very traumatic for women. Likewise for men, there were stories of them shaving off the beards and payas of men that they found on trains, on streets, etc. So this was a very traumatic part of the Gzeira, and the women part, meaning not allowing the women to shave their heads and cover them the way they wanted to, was another element of the Zar's Gzeira. Now, likewise, like I've been saying, the way basically it tracks with the different responses, meaning in the Kehilas that responded with a certain effort to adhere to the Zar's rules and to try to figure out how to comply with them. So they were mevater on this minig of shaving women's heads, and that's why it fell into disuse amongst large swaths of the Kehila. And today you'll be hard pressed to find anybody of Litvish Stak, and even many Hasidisin who adhere to that minig anymore. But some Hasidim, and especially Hasidim in Hungary, who were not subject to the Tsar's rules, adhered to these minig with a tremendous chaymer, and it became, a very important calling card of the community. So now, essentially, what we did over here is we bookmarked the end of this minig, right? We bookmarked the end of this minig or the somewhat end of this minig when it meets the Tsarist intervention, the Tsarist rules against Jewish modalities of dress. When all Jewish sartorial choices came under attack, so the haircut of Jewish women also came under attack. And in the Kehilas that tried to mitigate and mitigate their behavior and comply with the Tsar's rules, so they complied in this regard as well. Now, so what is this minig? Where does it start? What makes it so important? What's the makar? Where do we see it first? So now there's a new edition of Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, which he has a beautiful kuntras on his pirush on Tzava Mem Ches in Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. The mechaber of the Sefer has a beautiful kuntras, and a lot of what I'm going to quote comes from there. He has as follows. He brings a shaila. The first shaila that he brings that's relevant is as follows. Kayidua, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, this is what Tzava Mem Ches is. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says that on Rosh Chodesh one is not allowed to shave his head or cut his nails. Now we know that the Magen Avram in Hilchos Shabbos and Reish Samach Gimel brings this down that on Erev Shabbos, one who usually cuts his nails should not cut his nails or shave his beard, shave his head on Erev Shabbos, because we have to adhere to this Tzava Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. Now, whether or not all of Klal Yisrael is mekabel this particular Tzava Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, this particular Azara, is a shaila. Reb Moshe seems to have been makbid on it. Others were not makbid. Reb Yaakov famously brought down the difference between 2 days Rosh Chodesh and 1 day Rosh Chodesh, and that's not really a sugya for today. That's a different shmuz. But Yiach Shia the Ad Ephraim, Ephraim Zalman Margolius, is in the early 1800s. He has a shaila as follows. He says, Nishalti Bekala Shenisas B'Rosh Chodesh B'Erev Shabbos Kodesh. A kala who got married on Erev Shabbos, which is Rosh Chodesh, Shaminig Legaleach Cyrus Reisha Achar Achupa Kodem Achnasas Shabbos. Where the minig is that in the community that he's writing talk about him, the minig was to shave off all the hair in her head before Shabbos. It says in Lachosh L'Tzava Rabbi Yehuda Chassid Shalei Legaleach B'Rosh Chodesh. The question is, how is this impacted by the Tzava of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid not to shave your hair on Rosh Chodesh? Now, ultimately, Ephraim Zalman makes a diak in the lashon of the Tzava that it says ish lo yigalech. It doesn't say lo yigalech plain, so it sounds like it's more applicable to men than women. And since we don't really know the reasons or the rationale for Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's Tzava for many of the items, so we're going to adhere ein l'cha l'chidushay. And if it says ish, so we'll just adhere to ish, and Isha won't have this concern. And therefore, Ephraim Zalman is makel for this kala who got married in Erev Shabbos to shave her hair. But Yiach Shia, you see in Ephraim Zalman that this minig was nafutz and widely known at the time of Ephraim Zalman Margolius in the early 1800s. Similarly, the Chasam Sofer in Yeridei and Simon Kuf Tzadik Zayin, I believe, he has a shaila as follows. If a woman who's going to shave off her hair right after her chasana, but she goes to the mikvah on Erev her, on the eve of her wedding, she goes to the mikvah to be prepared. The shaila is, should her hair that is now going to be shaved off, as soon as the wedding's over, as soon as the next morning comes, her hair is going to be shaved off, should her hair be looked at as a chatzitza? And the Chasam Sofer in this tshuva is makel on that shaila of the hair being called a chatzitza. But again, you see that by the time of the Chasam Sofer, and this is a tshuva that's written, I think, 1836, close to the end of the Chasam Sofer's life, you see that the Chasam Sofer was well aware of this minig in certain cries in Klal Yisrael, and the Mela, the minig was widely known. And again, the Chasam Sofer's ruling is just that the tefillah is not considered a chatzitza, and that's all. Now, so fine. So Al Kapanim, we know that by the time the 1800s rolled around, this was a common and widely accepted minig that's referenced in the Paiskim, the Sha'ar Ephraim, the Chasam Sofer. Listen, it must have been widely common enough that even Zar Nikolai knew about it. So this was a widely common and known minig. Now, in this Sefer on Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, so this mechaber tries to advance the idea that this minig is of ancient origin. What he suggests, he's quoting from a tshuva from Menashe Klein in Chelik Yud Beis of his Chuvas Mishnah Halachas. Rabbi Menashe Klein quotes that he heard from the Kleisenberger Rebbe that this minig is a minig that stems from the Vad Arba Aratzos. Now, we've spoken about this in the past. The Vad Arba Aratzos was from, many of the areas, the vicinities that Jews lived in the 1600s and 1700s. There was a V'idah that would get together for the markets, different times of the year, and they would make some halachas, some rules, some regulations for the different kehillas. And Rabbi Menashe Klein brings from the Kleisenberger Rebbe that this is a carryover halacha that the Vad Arba Aratzos, comprised at some point, and therefore he suggests that it's very old. It's something from the beginning of the 1600s, and it's a very old, established minig. And Memela, says Rabbi Menashe Klein, and this is echoed in this Savas Rida Chassid, is that therefore someone from any one of these kehillas that were under the auspices of the Vad Arba Aratzos, which includes Poland, Litva, Belarus, Russia, obviously, all of this, anybody from these communities should have to adhere to the minig of the Vad Arba Aratzos, because normally the halacha b'minhagim is that if earlier there is some makabel minig, we don't have the ability to peel them back later on. So says Rabbi Menashe Klein that therefore anybody today who's has the ability and is not under government persecution should obviously have to adhere to this minig and should have to have his wife or his daughters, his wife, etc., shave all their hair once they get married to adhere to this minig. Now, the problem is as follows. The Kleisenberger Rebbe himself, in a different tshuva in Divrei Yatziv, and this the Mishnah Halachos doesn't bring, he himself says that he has heard that this comes from the Vad Arba Aratzos, but he says his lashon is like this: "Is lefi hayedua li hi mitakanos Arba Aratzos va'od mikoydem." Now that's somewhat unconvincing. Lefi hayedua li means he heard from somebody, heard from people that this minig comes to the Vad Arba Aratzos, but he has no source that it comes to the Vad Arba Aratzos, and that is true. There is no, today we have very limited, sources for takanos of the Vad Arba Aratzos, but the best way to know if something's, from that era, from the takanos of the Vad Arba Aratzos, is to look at the svarim of the different poskim and rabbanim who are involved in the Vad Arba Aratzos and see if they make any reference to this. Now, for example, just to give you a short list of poskim who would have been alive and operating during this time frame that it's being suggested that it comes from, that would include, for example, the Magen Avram, the Taz, the Shach, the Levush, the Prisha, the Bach, Chalkas Mechaykik, the Beis Shmuel, and many, many more. Of the Gedolei Poskim, in varying levels, their participation in the Vad Arba Aratzos is documented in varying levels, some more, some less. But to some degree, all of these people lived and operated within the realm of the Vad Arba Aratzos' power. Some of them were even leaders of the Vad Arba Aratzos, and none of them make any quote or any indication that they're aware of this minig. And they have all the opportunities. L'mashal in Archaim and Simonai and Hay, when the Shulchan Aruch discusses Sar Bisha Erva in regards to Kriyishma, many of those names that I just listed have, commentary and glosses on the page, on the Shulchan Aruch, on the different dinim over there, all in the Prate Dinim of Sar Bisha Erva, and they make no reference to this a supposed minig that should have existed in the day already. Or, for example, in Even Ezer and Simon Chaf Aleph, which is again by Hilchas Erva, and in Nida and Simon Kuf Tzadik Ches and Kuf Tzadik Tes, where it talks about Tefillah and Chatzitzis and Chafifis and all the extensive dinim that are related to a woman's hair when it comes to being tevel in the mikveh, and none of these nice kelim on the Shulchan Aruch make any reference to the fact that a woman, supposedly during that tkufa would have had her hair shaved off, which would alleviate almost all of these concerns. So seemingly, there's very little reason to believe that this is a minig that extends back into the 1500s or the 1600s. It's a minig that seemingly starts at a later date, because there's very little proof or evidence that it would have started earlier. Just in addition to that, in the Sefer, I forgot where he writes it, but Rav Shaul Brach, I think it was the Rav in Krasna, Hungarian Rav, in his Sefer B'Yos HaBoker, I'll read from you, he writes as follows. He says, B'Nos Yisrael, Shein Holchem B'Gilei Sar. He says, Ubesht v'Talmidim, the Baal Shem Tov and his Talmidim, in Higu Shelo Yehelem Sar Klal. Their Besht and his Talmidim made a minig that they shouldn't have any hair at all. Vim Kivade al Pidin Mutalahem Lasei Saris Ktsaris V'Nizhar Mechatzitza Mikol Makom Yafa Kayach Megalchem Kol Sarisein. He says, even though of course Vilchas Chatzitza, he's talking about regard to going to the mikveh, it's possible with short hair, but the Ma'aseh it's better to do this minig. So the Rav Shaul Brach, who was a Hungarian who Mustama kept this minig, who was older contemporary of the Satmar Rebbe, who was close to him, he writes that this is a minig that starts from the Chassidim, the Besht v'Talmidav. Now, if that's to be believed, if that's the truth, so then this is a minig that should be more dated somewhere around the late 1700s, call it 1780 or 1750, maybe call it 1750, 1775, something like that. In which case it would mean that this whole minig, by the time it got to the Czar, and meaning the minig's popularity amongst varying kehilas, like you see in the Chasam Sofer and the Sha'ar Ephraim and others, you see the Lamashal, the Netziv writes about this minig, the Netziv writes in favor of this minig, in one of his Chuvas in Meshav Davar. The popularity and success of this minig that was widespread amongst all these different varying kehilas of Yidden would have been a much, much later origin, something that started in the late 1700s and only continued into the mid 1800s, when in many, many kehilas it was dropped due to the Czar. So, to ascribe to it the chaimer that Reb Menashe Klein is saying, and that this Magian that Tzavav Yehuda Chassid is saying, is very hard to do, is very hard to take seriously. It's very hard to give it that type of chaimer. Granted, it's by today's point, it's a minig vasik in many, many kilas in Klal Yisrael, and if one is from such a kila, so Kaddish Emrele, of course he should adhere to the minig of his fathers, his grandfathers. At this point, it's going to be 10, 20 dairies of the minig of the kilas that adhere to it. But in kilas that don't adhere to it, it's not something that's gebracht in Shulchan Aruch. It's not something that comes from an actual Gemara or Chazal or etc. And therefore, there's much more, so to speak, wiggle room in the degree of this minig. Now, I had intended to continue and talk about some of the varying reasons for this minig. Meaning, now we know this minig exists and we figured out kind of where it starts. So, what are the rationales for the minig? What is the actual reason to have this minig? But I think I'm going to have to save that for a different occasion to continue. Be'ezus Hashem.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.